Today, we are wrestling with a really staggering contradiction. It's right there at the heart of the American economy.
Mm.
You might have seen the headlines. The U.S. recently harvested one of the largest, truly successful corn crops in its history. Fields across the Midwest just overflowing with grain.
A bumper crop. Should be good news.
Exactly. But instead of that translating into, prosperity, farmers are actually facing financial ruin. Prices have absolutely plummeted, hitting 5-year lows, and, well, hope seems to be fading fast.
Yeah, it sounds almost biblical, doesn't it? Like a feast leading straight into a famine. But the economic threat here is, it's very real
Right.
and very large.
Right.
And this isn't just, a local problem with corn or soybeans. It feels much more like a systemic collapse. And it's not driven by weather, not this time.
Yeah.
It's a combination of, policy missteps, rapid geopolitical shifts, and changing global strategies. The scale of this thing it's monumental.
Yeah, the numbers we thought.
Our sources are projecting the U.S. is facing a staggering $49.5 billion agricultural trade deficit by 2025.
$49.5 billion. Just let that sink in for a moment.
Yeah.
A deficit of that size.
Yeah.
That is a historic, just a shocking reversal. For decades, we had these consistent, reliable agricultural surpluses. They underpinned American economic power, gave us diplomatic leverage.
Absolutely. Help stabilize the whole national trade balance sometimes.
And now, a nearly $50 billion drag.
Precisely. It means the U.S. agricultural sector, which, has long been this source of immense national pride and global power, is now actually pulling the economy down. We're seeing a fundamental unraveling of a core American strength.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this. Because our mission today really is to figure out how a nation that still produces, more food than almost anyone else can simultaneously face what some critics are now calling Farmageddon.
Right, that term keeps popping up.
Yeah, and the source material makes it crystal clear. This crisis isn't some natural disaster. It's man-made, a man-made collapse.
Absolutely.
So we need to define those drivers. There's the inverted economics of that huge harvest, right? Then the sudden vanishing of key global markets.
The Mexico, yeah.
The, let's say, flawed policy response back home, the bailouts, and then, critically, this sudden, almost silent ascent of an unexpected competitor.
Our northern neighbor.
Canada?
Yeah, Canada.
Yeah.
It's quite a story. It really connects, strategic boardrooms in Beijing where they made these mandates to diversify away from the U.S., connects them directly to, say, rural Iowa farmhouses, where 3-4-generation family legacies are suddenly at risk. We need to understand how leadership in global agriculture might already be quietly shifting, moving towards more stable, maybe less volatile competitors.
Okay, let's start right there on the ground. The immediate financial reality for farmers, which is, frankly, brutal. And it hinges on this kind of inverted logic of the record harvest.
Right.
Normally, a bumper crop means you sell more, your revenue goes up. Simple. But instead, we saw corn prices just crater, dropping more than 36% from their peaks in 2022.
36%.
Falling below the break-even point for the vast majority of farmers.
And what that means in real terms, for the farmer standing in the field, it means every single bushel of grain they harvest, every truckload they haul, it's being sold for less than the variable cost it took to produce it.
So they're literally losing money just by harvesting.
They are literally losing money with every truckload they send to the grain elevator. It's a terrifying situation because the immediate logical incentive becomes, stop planting.
But they can't always do that, can
Wow. Many are locked into these cycles of debt, equipment loans, land payments that prevent them from just stopping. They have to plant, even if it means digging a deeper hole.
And as if collapsing prices weren't enough pressure, you mentioned this other side of the coin, soaring expenses, creating what you called a dual economic nightmare.
Yeah, it's a real double whammy.
So what's driving these incredibly high input costs? Fertilizer, seed, fuel.
Well, it's kind of a perfect storm, isn't it? You've got global market stress combined with domestic policy impacts. We're talking about input costs for absolutely critical items.
Right.
Fertilizer, seed, diesel fuel for tractors, equipment repairs, all climbing to some of the highest levels we've seen in recent memory.
Why fertilizer, specifically?
Fertilizer costs are really tightly linked to natural gas prices. Natural gas is a primary component, in making nitrogen-based fertilizers. So when global energy markets get volatile, like they have been,
It hits the farm directly.
directly translates straight into higher prices for the farmer. And then, as we'll get into later, you have things like tariffs on steel and aluminum. That drives up the price of new machinery, equipment, even just getting repairs done.
You're getting squeezed from both ends.
Yeah.
Revenue collapsing, costs soaring.
Exactly. That squeeze is what creates the agony. It leads directly to that heartbreaking question we saw in the source material.
Yeah, I remember that quote.
What is the purpose of planting if it only leads to deeper debt? I mean, for many, this isn't just about survival anymore. It feels like a form of slow financial strangulation.
And the human toll.
Mm.
This is where that grim term, Farmageddon, really comes from, isn't it? It's more than just balance sheets.
Oh, absolutely. We're seeing foreclosures are on the rise, threatening family farms, places that have been operating for generations. These aren't just businesses failing. These are literal homes, legacies being lost.
This is deeply personal.
Deeply. And the ripple effect, it doesn't stop at the farm gate. It extends throughout these entire rural communities.
And that's the critical piece for you, the listener, to understand. This isn't just happening out in the field somewhere isolated.
No way. It hits Main Street almost immediately. You see banks starting to restrict loans because their main collateral, the farmland itself, is actually falling in value. Equipment dealerships, they rely on farmers upgrading tractors or getting repairs. Some of them are closing their doors. Small town main streets are emptying out because the economic engine driving that whole community has stalled. It can turn these once vibrant farming centers into, well, it feels like a ghost town economy sometimes.
And then there's the psychological strain. The sources were quite blunt about this.
Yeah, heartbreakingly so. They highlight that mental health hotlines in many rural areas are reporting a dramatic surge in calls.
Really?
Yeah, and economists are openly warning that this relentless financial pressure, this feeling of hopelessness, is contributing directly to a rise in farm-related suicides.
That's incredibly tragic.
It is. It's the human consequence of what feels like a systemic failure. You have these communities that, once prided themselves on feeding the world, now being hollowed out from within by policy decisions and price collapses.
And this brings us to the bankruptcy numbers, which often get thrown around a lot of these discussions.
Right, the bankruptcy debate. It gets emotionally charged, understandably. So Chapter 12, Family Farm Bankruptcies, that's the specific legal chapter for family farmers. They rose to 595 filings in 2019.
Okay, 595.
That was nearly a 20% jump over the previous year, and actually the highest level seen since back in 2011.
595 bankruptcies. I mean, that sounds like an overwhelming number. It suggests this existential crisis across the entire sector. But there's a counterpoint here, right? We need to maintain some analytical perspective.
Yes, that's the essential, critical question we have to ask. Is Farmageddon truly an existential threat to the entire sector? Or is that term maybe, political hyperbole, designed perhaps to force immediate government intervention?
So what do the numbers actually say when you zoom out?
Well, while 595 bankruptcies is absolutely devastating for those individual families, let's be clear about that statistically speaking.
Yeah.
Out of over 2 million farms in the U.S., that number represents a failure rate of only about 0.03% of all farms.
0.03%.
Right, so analysts caution against using that specific number, 595, as a proxy for, widespread systemic collapse across the entire industry. Statistically, it's actually a tiny fraction compared to failure rates you might see in other business sectors.
Okay, so the economic reality is devastating for those specific families who are going under. Absolutely tragic. But the overall statistical rate of failure across the entire sector is perhaps surprisingly quite low.
Precisely. However, and this is a big however, the emotional weight, the political weight of those bankruptcies, combined with the extreme shock of losing major export markets and the massive decline in commodity prices.
It was enough.
It was more than enough to spur this unprecedented level of massive government intervention, the bailouts, which we definitely need to examine in detail later on.
Okay, so the financial death spiral was already happening, right? Low prices, high costs, just brutal market pressure. But that wasn't the whole story. What really broke the systems back, according to our sources, were these calculated geopolitical decisions made thousands of miles away.
Yeah, the external shocks.
How quickly did those key export markets actually vanish?
The speed was frankly shocking. We're talking about something like $4.8 billion in annual corn sales just gone, almost overnight.
Wow.
And this was driven by two big simultaneous geopolitical shocks that really exposed just how fragile America's reliance on a few key trading partners had become.
All right, let's tackle the biggest shock first. the pivot from Beijing. Our sources pinpoint a specific date,
Huh.
January 16th, 2025.
Yeah.
China, which had been the largest single customer for U.S. corn, and especially soybeans, just announced an immediate halt to all new orders for American crops.
Correct. And initially, yeah, farmers hoped this was just maybe a temporary negotiating tactic, a chess move in the ongoing trade disputes.
Right. Posturing.
Exactly. But how did the sources read this? Was this clearly different? Was it intended to be a permanent strategic pivot, not just a negotiation?
The consensus among the trade analysts we looked at was pretty clear.
Mhm.
This felt like a strategic mandate, not just a temporary pressure point. China's message seemed unambiguous.
Which was?
That they intended to permanently diversify their agricultural sourcing, the goal. To eliminate their future vulnerability to U.S. political pressure or trade volatility.
Huh.
For farmers in the Midwest, this wasn't a negotiation. It felt like the severing of a vital economic lifeline.
And this is geopolitics writ large, isn't it? How does a country like China physically secure that kind of diversification? It's not just about switching suppliers on paper.
No, it requires immense infrastructure investment, a global rewiring almost.
Right.
They immediately began strengthening relationships, signing long-term contracts with other massive suppliers around the globe. That meant locking things in with South America, particularly Brazil and Argentina, which, by the way, required huge investments in their port capacity and shipping routes down there.
Ah, okay.
They also looked towards Eastern Europe and, critically for our story, Canada.
Right, back to Canada.
The ultimate goal seemed to be ensuring the U.S. could no longer reliably wield its agricultural dominance as a sort of diplomatic or economic weapon over China's critical food supply. They wanted options. They wanted insulation.
Okay, so if China's strategic exit was the big headline that rattled the entire global ag market, what was happening closer to home? Something equally damaging, you said.
Yes, Mexico, which had long been this incredibly reliable, consistent customer for U.S. corn. They also began erecting significant barriers.
Yep, CO2 too.
This is the second hammer blow. And it was driven by a very different set of concerns. Mexico's barrier was fueled by growing domestic opposition to genetically modified corn, or GM corn.
The GMO issue.
Right. It started as more of a debate around health and environmental concerns, biotechnology, but it quickly escalated into a political stance, creating this major trade friction point.
And that's vital context. Mexico isn't just any customer for U.S. corn.
No.
U.S. farmers had relied on Mexico's stable, consistent demand for decades. It is a vital market, especially for non-premium corn varieties. So rejecting GM corn, that sent shockwaves through the American Farm Belt.
Because it suddenly put this massive regulatory hurdle right in front of what was a $4.8 billion annual trade relationship.
Yeah.
Decades of reliability questioned.
So you combine China's strategic, seemingly permanent withdrawal with Mexico's rejection of the standard U.S. GM corn supply.
Yeah.
And the systemic failure is just brutally exposed, isn't it? America's agricultural export system was entirely too reliant on just a handful of dominant and ultimately politically fragile export markets.
It really looks like a structural failure rooted in maybe complacency.
I think the sources would agree with that. They emphasize that decades of relying on China's sheer volume and Mexico's geographical convenience meant the U.S. largely ignored the need for continuous market diversification or, tailoring products more specifically for different customer needs.
We just assumed they'd always buy.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And that reliance proved incredibly fragile, almost obsolete the moment these single policy decisions, one in Beijing, one in Mexico City, could dismantle years of cultivated trade relationships. The U.S. was left vulnerable, exposed, and competitors were ready and waiting to step into that vacuum.
And this is where the story takes that, surprising and frankly, probably very frustrating twist for U.S. farmers. While America was reeling from these geopolitical shocks, watching exports plummet, an unexpected neighbor was quietly, strategically, and very effectively stepping up.
Canada.
We started looking northward, and then they looked internationally.
Indeed. While U.S. corn exports were in free fall, Canadian corn exports actually doubled. They surged to 1.4 million tons in a remarkably short period.
Doubled.
Yeah. And what's crucial to understand here, the sources say, is that this wasn't some aggressive, price-cutting market intervention by Canada. They didn't slash prices to steal share.
So what did they do?
They simply and very efficiently filled the void. They filled the orders created by rejected U.S. shipments and these U.S.-created trade disputes.
That's a brilliant, subtle strategy. They weren't trying to compete on the sheer colossal volume the U.S. offered.
No.
They were competing on stability, on credibility. They were basically filling the orders the U.S. couldn't fulfill anymore because of its own volatility.
That's exactly the non-economic advantage Canada gained almost immediately. International buyers, particularly big importers, were getting weary. They were frustrated by the constant volatility, the unpredictable trade disputes coming out of Washington.
Trade whiplash.
You got it. They began to see Canada as the stable, less controversial partner. And look, if you're responsible for feeding an entire nation, predictability often trumps slight price differences every single time.
And there's also that critical issue we just touched on, biotechnology. U.S. corn is overwhelmingly genetically modified, which fueled the rejection in Mexico. What was Canada's advantage in that perception battle?
Canada benefited significantly there, both from perception and often from reality. Buyers increasingly saw Canadian corn as, well, more sustainable, less politically charged.
Safer bet.
A safer bet, exactly. And often free from the controversies surrounding U.S. GMO varieties. This gave them a huge competitive edge in markets that had these lingering public health or environmental concerns about biotechnology. It helped them immediately capture not just the Mexican market void, but also some key European markets that were sensitive to GMOs.
And that enhanced credibility,
Yeah.
that reputation for stability and maybe non-GMO options.
Mhm.
It allowed them to penetrate markets that were historically considered American strongholds.
Yep.
Right? Places that traditionally bought U.S. grain almost automatically.
Absolutely. The sources specifically note that Canadian corn started showing up in significant quantities in markets like Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Spain.
Wow, those are core U.S. markets.
Core U.S. markets, exactly. Places where, due to historical shipping routes, long-term contracts, sheer inertia, they were American strongholds. And the analysis suggests this wasn't just a temporary blip, boost, just because the U.S. stumbled. Analysts are actually calling this Canada's silent agricultural revolution. They're not just filling orders, they're building long-term relationships based on reliability, stability, maybe different product attributes. Relationships that could permanently alter the global balance of agricultural power.
So the U.S. creates the chaos with tariffs and trade disputes, and our closest ally steps in, not just to, clean up the mess, but to establish themselves as a formidable, stable, long-term alternative.
Yeah.
That must feel like a double betrayal for American farmers watching this unfold.
Well, it certainly highlights a critical global shift, doesn't it? Canada's success, and let's not forget Brazil's massive gains in soybeans. It proves the world is actively choosing stability, predictability, and sometimes perceived sustainability over America's historically dominant but recently very volatile, volume-driven approach. This wasn't just a fluke year. The sources suggest this is a foundational change in global sourcing strategy. The world learned it could get its grain elsewhere.
Okay, given the scale of this financial ruin we've described and the sudden loss of billions in trade,
Yeah.
the U.S. government obviously had to respond. There was immense pressure.
Huge pressure.
Before we dive into the really controversial bailout program, let's quickly set the stage with the foundational safety net. That's the Farm Bill, right? Specifically, the 2018 version, which provides the core support system.
That's the bedrock. That legislation, which, by the way, costs an estimated $867 billion over 10 years, it provides the main safety net through programs you hear about all the time. Things like price loss coverage, or PLC,
PLC, right?
and agriculture risk coverage, or ARC.
Okay, for the listener, can you just briefly explain what PLC and ARC actually do? How do they function on a farm level?
Sure, they're critical, but they can be a bit complicated. PLC, price loss coverage, basically provides a price floor. If the national average market price for a fixed commodity, say corn, drops below a certain reference price set in the law,
Okay.
then the government issues a payment to the farmer to cover some of that difference. It protects against price collapses.
Got it. And ARC.
ARC, agriculture risk coverage, is a bit different. It's more of a revenue guarantee. It triggers payments if the actual farm revenue, which considers both the price and the yield the farmer got, falls below a calculated historical average revenue for that farm or county. So it protects against revenue declines, which could be low price, low yield, or both.
And crucially, a key feature, maybe a flaw, is that these payments are generally issued to the owners of historical base acres, right? Not necessarily tied directly to what they're planting right now.
Exactly. That linkage to historical base acres makes the system somewhat rigid. It's inherently better suited, frankly, for managing predictable, long-term, cyclical market fluctuations. Like an expected dip in prices because everyone planted too much corn one year.
Right.
It was structurally ill-equipped, just not designed, for a rapid, unpredictable, politically generated geopolitical shock, like a full-scale trade war that slams foreign markets shut almost overnight.
So the traditional safety net just couldn't cope.
It couldn't handle the speed or the specific cause of this particular crisis. The tools weren't right for the job.
Okay, so because that existing safety net basically failed to address this specific crisis, the government resorted to an ad hoc fix, a temporary patch.
Right.
And that fix was the Market Facilitation Program, or MFP, which was, let's just say it, highly controversial from the start.
Very controversial. The MFP was essentially a massive direct payment program, billions of dollars sent straight to farmers, and it was funded using the authority of the Commodity Credit Corporation, the CCC.
The CCC. Let's pause there for a second, because this is a crucial piece of, governance context. Why does the Commodity Credit Corporation have this kind of flexible, almost emergency funding power?
Right. The CCC is fascinating. It was actually created way back during the New Deal era, specifically to stabilize agricultural markets during crises. It has this unique power, a permanent discretionary line of credit of $30 billion directly from the U.S. Treasury.
$30 billion just sitting there.
Effectively, yeah. The idea is for it to be a quick-acting financial fire hose for farm emergencies. It can buy surplus commodities, make loans, or, as we saw here with the MFP, make direct payments.
But using it for the MFP was controversial. Why exactly?
Because it meant the executive branch, the administration, was unilaterally deploying billions of dollars to respond to a crisis that the executive branch's own trade policy had largely created.
Okay. Bypassing Congress.
Essentially bypassing the normal congressional appropriations process for this specific bailout money, it raised serious questions about executive overreach and accountability.
And the amount of money involved was just massive. What was the total cost of the MFP?
The estimates are that the MFP distributed a total of around $28 billion in direct payments just between 2018 and 2019.
$28 billion.
Yeah. And to put that into perspective, if you look at 2020, overall government payments to farmers, including MFP and other programs, reached $37.2 billion. That amount was equal to 36% of the total net farm income for the entire sector that year.
Wow, over a third of all farm income came from the government.
Yes. The government, and by extension, the U.S. taxpayer, essentially became the primary source of income for American agriculture, propping up a system that had been structurally crippled by trade policy.
That is the profound governance contradiction we mentioned earlier. The government's own policies helped create the crisis, and then the executive branch used this massive quasi-emergency financial authority to try and fix it, largely without direct legislative oversight for those specific funds.
A dangerous precedent, many argue.
Absolutely. And setting aside the governance issues, the program itself, the MFP, the sources say it was riddled with flaws, deep inequities in how the money was actually handed out.
Yes, the design reinforced many of the existing structural biases already present in the regular farm support system.
How so? How was the MFP designed inequitable?
Well, first off, it overwhelmingly favored the large-scale commodity producers, the big guys growing corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton.
The ones who benefit most from the regular farm bill, too.
Generally, yes. The numbers are stark. 94% of all the MFP aid went to growers of grains and oilseeds. 94%.
What about specialty crops? Fruits, vegetables, nuts. The things we talked about being potentially more resilient.
They got crumbs, relatively speaking. Specialty crop producers, many of whom also struggled with export markets, by the way, received only about 2% of the total MFP payments.
2% versus 94. Wow. Okay, talk about the distribution disparity. Where did the money actually end up? Geographically, demographically?
The distribution was highly concentrated. It really functioned in many ways as a form of wealth transfer to the very largest farming operations.
How do we know that?
A government analysis, I believe it was the Government Accountability Office, GAO, revealed that the top 10% of recipient, just the top 10%, received a staggering 58% of the total aid distributed.
More than half the money went to the top 10%.
Yeah. And furthermore, historically underserved farmers, including socially disadvantaged groups like American black farmers, they received a disproportionately tiny share. Only about 3.6% of the total payments went to all socially disadvantaged groups combined.
And you mentioned there was a specific sentiment among those underserved farmers. A quote.
Yes. The frustration was palpable. The founder of the National Black Farmers Association was quoted in one source saying that American black farmers were, quote, pretty much left out of that equation.
Hmm.
The feeling was that the government's fix focused solely on protecting the large established agribusinesses involved in bulk commodity production, not on ensuring equity or supporting diversity within agriculture.
So that concentration of aid just seems to perpetuate the very system that critics of the Farm Bill have argued about for years, that it favors large, established, often wealthier operations.
It absolutely did. It poured fuel on that existing structure. And, adding insult to injury, the actual formula used to calculate the payments, it was flawed too.
How is the formula flawed?
Well, the government was essentially rushing to estimate the trade damages caused by the tariffs for each commodity, and they didn't get it quite right. The 2019 payment structure, for example, created these bizarre regional disparities that didn't seem to make logical sense.
Like what?
For instance, according to analysis, corn producers in the South received an estimated average of $69 per acre in MFP payments. But corn producers out in the West received only about $29 per acre for suffering damage to the exact same commodity from the same trade war.
69 versus 29 for the same crop. How does that happen?
Analysts found that the hurried methodology used for estimating the trade damages led to significant overcompensation for certain crops relative to the actual estimated harm. Corn, specifically, was found to have been overcompensated by approximately $3 billion compared to the USDA's own internal estimates of the trade damage it suffered.
$3 billion in overpayments just for corn.
Based on those analyses, yes. So the taxpayer was funding this massive $28 billion bailout, much of which went disproportionately to the largest recipients, using a flawed formula that apparently even overpaid certain groups by billions of dollars.
It really brings the true cost of that trade policy failure directly back to the listener's pocket, doesn't it? Okay, so while corn got a lot of that MFP aid, maybe even too much, based on those overcompensation numbers, the commodity that was arguably most acutely damaged by the retaliatory tariffs wasn't corn. It was soybeans.
Oh, absolutely. Soybeans took the biggest hit, hands down. They accounted for the lion's share of the agricultural trade damage.
Why soybeans so much?
Because of China. China typically imports a monumental amount of soybeans. Something like 61% of all the world's traded soybeans end up there.
61%. Wow.
Yeah. And historically, over a fifth of all U.S. soybean exports went directly to China. It was the market.
So when China slapped on those retaliatory tariffs in 2018,
Devastation. The estimates are that those tariffs cost U.S. agriculture around $27 billion annually in lost sales. And soybeans alone accounted for a staggering 71% of those annualized losses.
71% of the damage was just soybeans.
Yes, a colossal loss. And it was immediately capitalized upon by competitor nations, primarily Brazil.
Dill stepped in again.
They moved with incredible speed and, frankly, structural efficiency. Brazil had actually already surpassed the U.S. back in 2017 to become the world's largest soybean producer and exporter, even before the worst of the trade war.
Okay.
But they accelerated their growth dramatically during the dispute. They seized the opportunity to capture permanent market share in China. And they did it by leveraging infrastructure improvements, things like better rail links connecting their interior farms to their ports investments. The U.S. hadn't really matched at the same scale.
So Brazil was ready.
They were ready. And now American soybean farmers face this intense long-term uncertainty because China has often avoided making large pre-purchases of U.S. soybeans for the upcoming harvest season the way they used to. It creates this constant state of flux, making future planning incredibly difficult for U.S. farmers.
It's also really important to remember, isn't it, that tariffs kind of boomerang. They don't just hurt exports, they can hurt the very people they're sometimes supposed to protect. In this case, American farmers on the cost side, too.
Absolutely. The tariffs imposed by the U.S. on imported materials like steel and aluminum, they drive up the costs for essential farm equipment and machinery. It adds directly to that financial squeeze, that double whammy we talked about earlier.
Right, the input costs.
That trickle-down effect is quantifiable, and it's painful. We saw specific data from major manufacturers in the sources.
Like who?
For instance, the big one, tractor maker John Deere. They publicly stated that the higher tariffs on steel and aluminum would likely cost them an estimated $600 million in the year 2025 alone.
$600 million, just for John Deere. And how does that cost specifically filter down and hit the individual farmer?
Well, think about what a modern combine or a large tractor is built out of. Specialized steel, lots of aluminum, complex bearings, engines, components, many of which are sourced globally.
Right.
When the cost of those basic raw materials gets inflated by tariffs, John Deere or Case IH or any manufacturer really only has two choices. absorb the massive cost increase and hurt their own profits or pass it on to the buyer, the farmer.
And they usually pass it on.
Farmers worry, quite legitimately, that this inflation will raise the prices they pay for everything. New combines, specialized tillage equipment, even just essential repair parts, and potentially fertilizers too if tariffs hit components needed for production there. So they feel like they're being hurt by the tariffs coming and going, losing their export markets and paying more for the tools they need to farm.
This whole picture sounds like an unmitigated disaster across the entire agricultural export sector, just negative impacts everywhere. But we have to acknowledge the counter-narrative. There was at least one case mentioned where tariffs were viewed very differently, not as a curse, but maybe as a blessing.
Right.
Let's look at domestic shrimp farming for a minute.
Yeah, this is a fascinating little data point that really shows the complexity of trade policy. It's not always simple, so get this. Over 90% of all the shrimp eaten in the U.S. is actually imported.
90%.
Yeah, it amounts to something like 1.6 billion pounds annually coming from overseas.
Wow.
So domestic shrimp farmers, and yes, there are shrimp farms, even in unlikely inland places like Indiana, they face this absolutely overwhelming competition from low-cost imports, primarily from countries like India, China, Thailand, Vietnam, places where labor costs and environmental standards are often far lower than in the U.S.
Okay, so for those domestic farmers, tariffs imposed on those low-cost shrimp imports, they saw that differently.
Completely differently. They saw those tariffs as essential protection, a lifeline for a small, struggling domestic industry trying to compete against this flood of cheap imports.
It needed the protection.
Their goal was simple, really. If the imported shrimp cost rises because of tariffs, making it more comparable in price to the domestic product on the shelf, well, maybe consumers would be more likely to choose the fresh, locally farmed American option.
So it illustrates that trade protection, while absolutely devastating for major commodity exporters like corn and soybean farmers who rely on massive global volume.
Yeah.
It can be seen as a vital lifeline for smaller, domestic-focused industries that are struggling against heavily subsidized or just overwhelmingly cheap global supply. It depends entirely on which side of the tariff wall you're standing on.
Okay, reflecting on everything we've discussed, the crisis seems to make one conclusion pretty crystal clear. The U.S. cannot simply hope to return to that past era of, unchallenged agricultural dominance that was built purely on massive volume and relying on just a handful of huge trade relationships. That model seems broken, or at least extremely vulnerable now.
Right. The future seems to require a fundamental reinvention, a pivot away from a strategy based purely on sheer scale, towards one focused more on sophistication, resilience, and really strategic diversification.
The imperative for change, I think, has to start with policy. Specifically, strategic trade diversification. We simply must stop over-relying on single large importers like China, who prove they can just turn off the tap overnight for political reasons.
So the focus needs to shift.
Aggressively shift, yes, towards cultivating more nuanced relationships with a wider range of growing economies. Think Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, more in Latin America, beyond just Mexico.
What does cultivating a nuanced relationship actually mean in practice? Is it just finding more buyers?
It's more than that. It means moving beyond just, dumping raw bulk commodities on the lowest bidder. It requires really understanding their specific consumer preferences, which are often shifting rapidly in those growing economies towards more premium products, traceable foods, specialty items.
So selling value, not just bulk volume.
Exactly. Selling value, specific attributes, maybe even sustainability credentials. We need to tailor our offerings.
We actually saw a successful case study within this period of turmoil that might offer a template for that kind of future, the specialty crop market in India.
Yes. That's a great example from the sources. India is generally a very difficult market for U.S. bulk grains like wheat or corn because they are fiercely focused on achieving self-sufficiency in those basic staples. They have protectionist policies.
Right.
However, India became the largest buyer of U.S. tree nuts, specifically almonds and pistachios. They even lifted tariffs on those items during this period. The U.S. now supplies something like over 70% of India's entire almond imports.
Why were specialty crops like tree nuts more resilient in that relationship than the bulk commodities like corn and soybeans?
Well, tree nuts are generally higher value products, often seen more as luxury goods or health foods, not as basic bulk staples used for animal feed or government food security reserves. This makes them less subject to the kind of government political control or heavy protectionist policies that often target staple foods.
Yeah.
It really shows a clear path forward, doesn't it? These niche, higher value, often consumer-facing markets seem far more resilient. They offer a more stable foundation than relying solely on bulk staples that are tied directly to geopolitical tensions and food security politics.
Okay, so diversifying markets and products is key internationally. What about domestically? Does the policy framework here at home need an overhaul too?
Absolutely. That current subsidy system, the one that disproportionately funneled all that MFP bailout money we talked about,
Yeah.
it actively incentivizes the overproduction of low-margin commodity crops like corn and soybeans year after year.
It encourages planting more corn and soy.
Exactly. That framework needs serious reform. It's creating economic distortions and vulnerabilities. We need policies that actively encourage more crop diversity on farms, policies that provide real support for farmers who want to transition towards growing higher value specialty crops, and policies that genuinely bolster local and regional food systems.
Why local and regional?
Because building a more robust and diverse domestic market creates a vital buffer. It provides insulation against those unpredictable international trade shocks. If you have strong local demand, a hit to exports doesn't become an existential crisis overnight.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Finally, looking ahead, survival and competition, especially against those cripplingly high input costs we discussed. It seems to necessitate a full-scale embrace of the agri-tech revolution, doesn't it? Technology has to be part of the answer.
It feels non-negotiable for future competitiveness. Precision agriculture, for instance, offers a direct antidote to some of those crippling high costs for things like fertilizer and fuel.
What does precision ag involve, practically?
We're talking about technologies that are becoming more mainstream now. GPS-guided tractors that operate with inch-level accuracy, preventing overlap and saving fuel. Drone surveillance using specialized cameras to do microscopic crop health analysis, spotting problems early. Soil sensors that communicate exactly how much irrigation or fertilization is needed in specific parts of a field, not just broadcasting it everywhere.
So using resources much more efficiently.
Drastically cutting expenses, reducing waste, improving overall efficiency. These tools allow U.S. farmers to potentially compete globally, even with higher labor costs, by being smarter and more targeted with their inputs.
And beyond the field, we also see the rise of things like controlled environment agriculture or vertical farming.
Exactly. Now, CA or vertical farming isn't going to replace traditional broadacre farming for bulk commodities anytime soon, let's be realistic.
Right.
But it represents a crucial and rapidly growing resilient sector. It's largely immune to volatile weather patterns and global trade disputes. By growing high-value specialty produce like leafy greens, herbs, strawberries year-round, often right inside or near urban centers,
It shortens supply chains.
dramatically, it ensures a stable local supply, reduces transportation costs and emissions, and creates this whole new intelligent sector of high-value agriculture where the U.S. can potentially lead. The takeaway really seems to be that the crown of global agricultural dominance is no longer a birthright based just on having vast open fields and producing sheer volume.
It has to be re-earned.
It absolutely has to be re-earned through innovation, diversification, adaptation, redefining leadership, maybe not just by tons produced, but by sustainability, efficiency, and intelligence. #TakeTag outro.
So this deep dive into the unraveling of America's agricultural empire, it seems defined by three really interwoven key drivers, doesn't it?
I think so.
First, you had the collapsing prices and the soaring costs, pushing farmers below break even during that record harvest.
Right.
The internal financial squeeze.
Right, the economics turned upside down.
Second, the calculated geopolitical shift. China and Mexico making strategic decisions to permanently diversify away from relying solely on the U.S. supply chain, the vanishing market.
It's external shocks, yeah.
And third, the quiet, almost unnoticed strategic ascent of Canada, building trust, filling the void, and capturing market share, while America was essentially creating instability for its own producers.
The competitor rising.
Yeah.
And the broader implication here, it extends far beyond just rural hardship or farming economics. Right? Oh, much further. This feels like the structural unraveling of a really key pillar of American global leadership. For decades, agricultural exports weren't just about money.
No.
They provided essential non-military leverage. They helped stabilize the nation's overall trade balance. They gave Washington important diplomatic tools to use at the bargaining table around the world.
Food is power.
Food is power, exactly. The loss of that prowess, or even just the significant weakening of it, translates directly into having fewer tools, less influence on the global stage.
Okay. So as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive today, maybe consider this final provocative thought. If agricultural dominance truly provided essential non-military leverage for Washington for so long, How will the U.S. maintain its global influence now that the world has seemingly proven it can reliably feed itself, or at least find alternatives, without relying quite so heavily on the American heartland?
Hmm, that's a heavy question to end on.
Something to mull over. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.